We're going to head into the conversations section of this Auckland Conversations, dear everyone. So panelists, are you ready? We're very organised. We're going to do this in a very wonderfully, try not to talk over each other kind of way, but the idea here is to enter into a, let's all have a chat about stuff. So panelists, I'm going to direct questions to you each individually, but if there's anything you'd like to add to a fellow panelist's answer, please raise your hand. And as I said before, I'll try not to be too much like a school teacher, but definitely try and get you all having a chat as much as we can on Zoom. So dear Narimu, if it's all right to start with you again, I'm actually going to combine a couple of questions because I know you spoke into this in your opening introduction. The topic of conversation tonight, as we know, is greening the city in terms of how we can incorporate the natural environment and systems thinking into the city centre. So can you talk to us about what that means and looks like from a Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei perspective? And are there any examples in the city centre that align with your thinking or are maybe on the way to aligning that we're working on out there?
Yep. Greening the city. I'd probably call it browning the city. We want to make it Māori again, and green's a part of that. I was just going through Logan Campbell's book, John Logan Campbell's book, Pounamu again last night, and he's talking in there about approaching into Ōrākei Bay on his dinghy and pulling up and wanting a kai, and within a few minutes they've got 15 kukupa, 15 wood pigeons for dinner and chucked in a pot. And so I guess the simple goal for many Māori is we just want to eat decent pigeons in the city again, not those rats with wings. So how do we go about achieving that? So that comes down to what we're planting in our parks. We need the pūriri rather than the oak tree, and what are we planting in the streets? What are we encouraging private properties to plant as well? So yeah, really just thinking with our stomachs on this one is kind of helpful, but also thinking about what do birds need to eat to survive? And I've been around a little bit now. I think it started scrapping with Hal's predecessors, the city arborists, about what was being planted in the city centre. We won a few battles. We learned off each other, and we did some good stuff in Aotea Centre. That started out, the first plan is, I can't remember what they were, Hal, but I think the trees were from Mexico. But we ended up with mostly natives, and I've seen tui up there now, coming out of the town hall, which is amazing. St. Pat's Square, another one, which started out as all exotics in the first scheme, which we changed. Wynyard's just taken it to another level, as has Quay Street. But probably a little piece of paradise for me, which looks a little bit maybe what it used to look like for my ancestors 6 and 7 generations ago when Hobson arrived, and Logan Campbell is a little bit left down in Simon Street Cemetery under the Grafton Bridge at the headwaters of the Waiparuru stream. A little piece of magic still there, a lot of exotic stuff as well, but there's a Kia stand in there. I hope it's still there. I haven't been there for a couple of years. And a 30-40 metre stretch of the original stream. So that's what we should be aiming for, to me, and noting some good stuff that's happened in the last 20 years. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Ngāti Moon. Thank you for all your mahi and helping those things happen. I might actually throw to Hal next, just because the conversation seemed to head your way, Hal, and a question here, which I think hopefully follow on from Ngāti Moon, definitely, but there's a lot of technical work that goes into ensuring trees not only survive but flourish in their urban environment. Can you give us a bit of an overview on this, if you've had any recent examples of where this has been done in the city centre, and maybe adding to that, what happens when we plant species that are indigenous? What happens when you're working with plants that are of a land? In your humble opinion, good sir.
Yeah, it's been a long journey, I guess. First in that, to talk about, what do we need to provide for trees in the city centre? I guess in urban spaces, the biggest issues that we face is finding space for trees. You know,
Mm.
above ground space is relatively easy for us to see and manage. It's the below ground space that's really important, the actual physical connection to Papatūānuku. You know, the trees need to connect to the land to actually grow well. And I think, you know, we're starting to recognize that a lot more now with some of the designs, you know, in terms of the work I guess I've been involved with over the last sort of, I guess, 15 years really has been focused on trying to work with engineers and planners and everybody else to understand the issues that they have with us planting trees. Because, you know, when I first started with City Park Services back in 1995, I was planting trees where we literally cut out a little hole in the tar seal pavement and planted a tree. You know, now we dig very large trenches, we fill them with good quality soil, we provide a really good environment for the trees to grow in. And I think that's, I guess, one of the biggest challenges that are faced over the time, as Narimu's talked about. I mean, if you look at Aotea Centre, we're dealing with a rooftop garden. Not many people realize that, you know, you have trees planted on top of what is the roof of the car park. It's a 4-story car park below. So, you know, managing how we can plant trees into that environment is very challenging. You know, some of it's been successful and some of it's not. Same as St. Pat's Square. I think for me, over the last 10 years, you know, Auckland City has really, Auckland Council has really focused on providing really high quality space, which I think was, you know, first rolled out with Queen Street. Then, you know, the Wynyard Quarter, which you've, you know, been involved with over, you know, a decade now, and seen how that's developed. I think, you know, what we've really, you know, we've challenged everybody else to give, I guess, trees space, because at the end of the day, trees are probably the most important part of that urban fabric where we want people to connect to. You know, they actually provide that realism, I guess, of nature's still there in the city, although we know it's, you know, sirens and you know, lights and everything else, and you know, that's really foreign to birds. But the one thing that birds really recognize are trees. And as Narimu says, you know, we now start to see tui in the city because we now have things like kofi planted, which are a food source for them. You know, interestingly, I saw a wood pigeon sitting on one of those exotic trees on Mayoral Drive last year. And, you know, that's just a resting place. So it's a funny thing that you know, birds and animals don't really recognize the difference between exotic and native trees. But in my experience, the more that we've worked with, you know, Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei and Mana Whenua, and just listening to the kaitiaki of the land of what we should be planting, you know, some of the spaces that we're now creating are really successful and putting us on an international stage. You know, you look at Quay Street. Quay Street is a great example of what is a mini forest. We've created a mini New Zealand forest right on our doorstep, you know, and so when people come to New Zealand, when they finally allowed back, on those, you know, thousands of people that turn up on their cruise ships, and they get off the boat and they walk along Quay Street, and they will see what was, as Narimu talked about, original, you know, species that were found in the original forest of Aotearoa. And that's really challenging to do that in a space that's dominated by cars, vehicles, utilities. Everybody wants their lights. Everybody needs, you know, water, sewer. Finding the space to actually put a tree in amongst all of that plethora of utilities is really, really challenging, you know. And I guess through engineers, you know, maybe it's me for banging on their doors long enough to encourage them to provide space for trees, because as you now see, the trees that we've got planted in Wynyard Quarter you know, it's a very successful, prosperous, engaging area that brings people to Auckland. You know, us creating that as a group of people, and there's a lot of hard mahi's gone into that, as you know, with all of the engineers and the contractors and everything else. I mean, that's not delivered overnight. There's years of work going into that. So I think we need to sort of, you know, recognize that.
Amazing, thank you, Hal. And you know, sort of don't want to sound glib, but we also care about oxygen, which is why we should care about trees. I think also encourage the audience, if you haven't done study into what happens under the ground, we think that a tree is that big, but actually there's quite a lot. If it's all right to recommend a book in front of you, Hal, Finding the Mother Tree is a very useful read, but understanding what trees need underneath the ground is not a bad bit of research to do, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to stay on the theme of what Council's up to, if it's all right to hand to you, Councillor Richard Hills. And would you be okay to tell us about some of the work that is being done in the city centre that shows the Council's level of commitment to achieving some of the outcomes of those strategic plans that we're putting out there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just a list more generally of the recent big changes, I guess, that in 2018, the natural environment targeted rate across the whole city, but also the city centre, enabled hundreds of millions of dollars through Aucklanders offering, basically. The submitters, well over 2/3 of the submitters said they wanted to pay more for improving our biodiversity across Tamaki Makaurau, and that includes tree planting, pests, and everything else. But also this year, we approved the 10-year budget, and we secured significant budget for more trees, including 11,000 more mature street trees, 200 hectares of forest in our regional parks, 200,000 seedlings in our nurseries, but also all of our projects now, there's a far bigger focus on native trees, forests, as Hal was saying. I mean, council help approve these things, the public help support these things and lobby us, but it's the people like Hal who do the mahi, the people that, Hal took Councillor Coombe and I out to the Blackbridge nurseries, where I've seen trees that have been sitting there for years and years and years, ready to go into our projects. So I've seen the puriri that have just been recently planted in Firstmere Road. We stood next to them there, and all the planting that was the 200 mature native trees that have been planted in Te Wānanga and Key Street. And that was Hal's team, but also Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei Nurseries. I was there on the day that all that understory was planted, and it, as both Ngāti Mu and Hal have said, that they're the original plants that were there before when it was coastline, and that was so special, speaking to those from Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei who were planting it and bringing back those indigenous species. But also, I think when you talk from a climate perspective, yes, trees reduce carbon, but I think one of the biggest things about things like Key Street and Te Wānanga, that was also about making that space. So removing 4 lanes of traffic and providing space for trees. So you're not going to, trees aren't going to fix climate change. Yes, if we planted a 500 billion, I think it is, it will reduce carbon emissions by about 25%. But, we can do our part. Obviously water quality and air quality, but it is if you are transforming spaces and removing concrete and removing cars and removing things and giving it over back to nature, and in this case Key Street, Te Wānanga, Wynyard Quarter, as Hal says, by the Viaduct Event Centre there, those groves of Puhutakawa now have hundreds of tui in them. I wait for my bus now down by on Key Street, and there are tui and piwaka waka in those trees already. I mean, pre-lockdown, and those trees have only been there a short time, so that already the birds and animals are coming back. So I know it's not perfect, but I think we are really, really ramping up in all cases extra budgets. But I know that Healthy Waters, your team, Frith at Panuku, all the new greening of our streams and getting rid of the pipes and putting in that understory in those native plants, like right across Tamaki Makaurau. But the Vic Linear Park is going to be, I don't think people realize, I think it could be better than the design. The design is amazing, but people are already saying there's too much concrete. And probably 4 or 5 years ago, people were saying, how dare you rip up all that concrete? So I think that the public is moving ahead of us, which is fantastic. But I think that we're going to have forests all the way through our city centre. And if we're doing this now, imagine what people are going to be demanding, and the elected members working in partnership finally from the beginning with Mana Whenua are going to achieve in the next 5 to 10 years. There was almost no trees in the Wynyard Quarter 12 years ago, and it's like a forest down there between all the buildings. So yeah, there's a lot more to come, but I'm pretty proud of what the city is doing and all the workers across it. So
yeah, kia ora, Richard. It's it's a team sport, one might offer. It's pretty exciting to be a part of that change, and exciting to see where it might end up when somebody says plant trees that you won't get to sit under. So ability to think long range, and accrediting people like your good self on thinking like that. I wonder if we can stay at the why are we having this conversation level, which Richard just touched on, and go to you, Natalie. Are you able, Dr. Natalie Allen, to explain to us the concept of designing for well-being, and what parts trees, plants, parks and green spaces play in this?
Easy, Frith.
Easy peasy.
Well, I guess, like, first of all, well-being is really multifaceted. So we need to consider the impacts of the world around us on our health, our emotional, spiritual, and cultural well-being, as well as our impact on the world around us. So I really connect with the Te Whare Tapa Whā model that also includes whenua, the land and roots, as part of our overall well-being and how we understand it. And I think also there's other ways that you can kind of look at it in terms of well-being being about, you know, our subjective perceptions of how we're being affected and how we're affecting the world around us. Social connections, safety and security, as Chloe mentioned, is a critical part of well-being. You know, community wealth is actually a really key part of well-being as well. Our education, you know, skills, ability to have leisure and recreation opportunities, the access and mobility we have to move around and connect with one another. All these kind of different aspects come together, and, you know, critically, cultural identity underpins so much of that as well. And then we've kind of got the usual understanding of health as well, being sort of the physical impact on us. And I think it's, you know, so often we fall into the trap of trying to oversimplify it, but we really need to live with that complexity and acknowledge that it is so multifaceted, and it needs to function across scales. And so I guess the part that, you know, trees, plants, parks, green spaces, etc. play in this is because it's really about creating those spaces, those environments for all those well-beings to come together, because, you know, we exist in the world around us, and we like the tactility of it. You know, we want to be able to engage, and I think that, you know, trees, plants, etc. enable us to do that. There's some fantastic research actually that's been done, and a shout out to Gail Salter-Brown from AUT, who's looked at the impact of sensory gardens, you know, on how students were able to sort of, you know, stay on top of their lives, and that extends to all of us, is that sensory experience around us is critical. And I guess I could cover it later, but I just also want to flag that, you know, edible landscapes are also critical in this process. And so, you know, when we think of well-being and our health, it's not just that, you know, they create spaces where we can, you know, breathe fresh air, etc., but they also give us the opportunity to have access to food. And we know that across our city, that is an issue for many people.
Awesome. Thank you, Natalie. Chloe.
Yeah, I apologise. I just wanted to not butt in there, but to add as an addendum. Strong on top of what Natalie has just said, but, you know, we know, and we have an evidence base from Kia Oranga, the Mental Health and Addiction Inquiry that the government commissioned, which actually was kind of groundbreaking in that the very first time the government commissioned research on mental health, which wasn't triggered by a really traumatic event, but also looked at the social and environmental factors that determine mental ill health. And what it found is reflective of the majority of contemporary research out there, that all of us, of course, have biological predispositions towards, you know, greater or lesser manifestation of mental ill health, but it is largely our environment and our context that can help to turn those things up or down a notch. So particularly it's that access to those outdoor spaces. I mean, Councillor Hills was saying before, we've got a number of people living in the city centre. That's been particularly profoundly felt during the COVID lockdowns, as I've been advocating for testing stations and vaccination sites that people can walk to, because we also have the lowest rates of car ownership here. You know, 40,000 people live in the apartments and townhouses in the city centre, and I'm one of them. And this is our backyard. So having access to a space that actually is a backyard, particularly as we contemplate the NPSUD changes going through Parliament tonight, you know, these are really important critical conversations that we have to be having about how we also enable a just transition. something which doesn't set us up for potential gentrification of these spaces and push people who can't afford to be in these spaces further and further out. I don't want to see a future where we have kind of enclosed gardens a la New York or London for the old money. I want to see public spaces that are available and accessible to everybody and that are informed by transitional move number 1 in the CCMP, which is Māori outcomes.
Amazing. I think you've, because we've just totally practiced this and we're awesome. I think you actually just managed to answer the question I was going to ask you about the impact you believe green spaces and urban environments will have on our mental health and the wellbeing of our communities. So I might follow on from that with you, Chloe, and say as MP for Auckland Central, can you give us some examples of developments or innovations that you're proud to see coming to life or that give you hope?
Yeah, I am. I'm really actually to the point that Narima was making before about quote unquote browning the city and what Natalie was saying around the likes of our soil. There's some really cool opportunities with particularly community gardens and the opportunity that provides for actually reinvigorating our soil, which has been so depleted by some of the actions that largely actually colonial practice have imposed on this whenua. So there's been some really awesome proposals and some amazing fighting from people like Sarah Smuts Kennedy from For the Love of Bees. Need a shout out actually to Waitemata Local Board as well, who have invested quite a substantial amount in doing the background work on what it takes for council to approve kind of spaces and places for these community gardens. That might potentially actually require legislative change because of the deeds of kind of transfer for the land. So there's a cool local bill potentially in there to progress through Parliament, so everyone keep an eye out for that. Been also progressing some mahi over the past few years, particularly off the back of learning more and more about what was playing out at Canal Road for tree protection. So in the Environment Select Committee, when we were doing RMA reforms about 2-3 years ago now, I put up an amendment at the Environment Select Committee, didn't get that through. So I'll leave you all to read the politics there. Eugenie Sage also actually has a members bill on the ballot at the moment that would reinstate that too. I think, you know, around the CCMP and around Queen Street in particular, and the kind of stitch across the parks that we've been speaking to, there's some really amazing opportunities that I'm really stoked to support. But I also think thinking about our really unique space right next to Tika Pomoana, the Hauraki Gulf, is a really also quite phenomenal opportunity for us. And that is another thing which is reflected in the CCMP. And there's been an amazing example of what can happen when mana whenua are properly, meaningfully engaged and council works and does the mahi and invests with the likes of Te Wānanga. So more of that, please.
Awesome, awesome work. Thank you, Chloe. I've got a very selfish question about apartment dwellers, but I might hold that if we have time. Ian, to you, good sir, you recently said in an article in The Listener that one idea is to think of nature strategically as green infrastructure. Can you tell us what that means, and can you see how and where this approach could be applied and should be applied to Auckland city centre?
Yeah, thanks, Riff. Well, green infrastructure, or GI, is a term academics came up with about 20 years ago, partly out of frustration that the contribution nature brings wasn't recognized. So the idea is we've got grey infrastructure, which we know about, the pipes, the roads, and we know those perform functions and we accept that uncritically. But we've also got green infrastructure, trees, parks, community gardens, the green strips by highways even, and they perform functions too. So the idea was by adopting the terminology of traditional infrastructure, its benefits could become more easily accepted by engineers and politicians and so on. I think there's a few extra nuances which were, it helps you look at it from a strategically planned network perspective and the infrastructure terminology just automatically makes you think about scale and connectivity. And it also, another thing that it stresses is around multifunctionality. So a lot of our grey infrastructure areas, they don't serve multiple purposes. A car park does a car park. But if you think about the value we have in urban land, we need it to be multifunctional. We need it to do health, climate adaptation, habitat, recreation. And so places which are more multifunctional should be more valuable. So that's one of the ideas. I think green infrastructure is a little like vaccination rates in the fact that every little helps, but you want to target it really to get the biggest advantages. So I mean, we did some research looking at the impacts of climate change and trying to look at the densification agenda and look at the, to try and quantify and get a figure on how much green infrastructure could make a difference and take the load off our pipes in order to give that a financial calculus. And we worked out even a small amount of green infrastructure, 5 or 10% of green in, we call it green in the matrix, green in an area will have a significant influence by reducing the load on your pipes. So it can actually save money, and we can quantify that. And then we added another layer of information, which is around the characteristics of neighborhoods. We know that poor areas have less parks, for example. So by targeting investment in green infrastructure in areas where we know there are green deserts, or where we have underserved population, we can actually use our scarce public resources pretty well. And the last thing we did was we looked at who owns the land. So basically one of the problems with this entire agenda is that private property rights mean you can't do what you want when you want to do a network. So, but just by looking at publicly owned lands and council land, we worked out it was completely feasible to have this effect on a surface runoff. So one of the main threats, and I'll just finish off by saying a couple of wider points around, I think one of the real threats and opportunities is its synergies with the rapid densification agenda we're having right now. And if we don't take proactive steps, the green space we have now will be the most we will ever have. Development's going to gradually erode what we have. We've got creeping urbanization, and we need to focus on the quality of life associated with that. Community gardens has come up a few times, which are a brilliant example of social connectivity, as well as food miles, food security, health. So we need to look at the spaces between development footprints, which we don't do very well. But if you think about it from an infrastructure perspective, it makes sense. So I just want to end up by saying that every park or green space anyone listening to this has ever enjoyed was a result of a battle over public space that might have happened long before you were even born. Those green spaces you enjoy today are a gift from past activists, planners, and politicians. And that's what I want us to think about today, is how can we, given our development pressures, how can we leave a beneficial legacy to who comes behind us too?
Amazing, Ian, thank you. What I'd like to do now, if it's all right with the panel, is sort of jump between our prepared questions and what we can see coming through in the Q&A. So lovely people putting questions in the Q&A. Thank you. I'm gonna jump around and hopefully get to a brilliant range if possible. Oh, brilliant. I think I'm going to learn how to use it. If it's all right, I'm going to start with a question I can see from Margaret Stanley, if that's all right with Ashley, who's actually the boss of me this evening. But it follows on from something Ian asked, and it's pretty central to our conversation around the CBD. How can private businesses and landowners in the city centre be supported and incentivised to plant native species to increase biodiversity and cultural benefits? Does anyone on the panel want to have a crack at that one as a starter? They need to. We'd like them to, hey?
I can give a really, oh no, Ian, go for it.
Well, I'll be very quick then, Claire. I think it's not the most productive avenue to follow. I think you have your planning rules which can protect stuff, but really a lot of the nature that we see in gardens isn't native. There's a colonial legacy. But if you look at who owns land in urban areas, you can really make a lot of ground with regard to using the state, or even having planning policies, which if we're going to have much more denser urban footprints, we need to lever an investment in greening attached to that direct investment.
Awesome. Chloe, did you want to get in there too?
I was just going to throw out a bit of a grenade for everyone to respond to, which was, what about all the golf courses? Which is also a point actually about affordable housing and the links to which will go to subsidise with people on rent and rates certain kinds of activities in our city. But I also, just wanted to talk about the point that had been made by Ian about, where we can most productively use our resources in there. And I think, councils, lands that it currently has access to, but also I think providing greater education for people by virtue of exposure to these trees trees, these urban ngahere in public spaces is also incredibly beneficial. Inviting the public to engage in things like hands-on tree planting is also massively beneficial. I was over in the UK back when we were allowed to internationally travel, with it being 10 years subsequent to them passing their equivalent of the Zero Carbon Act, the Climate Change 2008 Act. And they had their equivalent of the Ministry of for the Environment, working with the Ministry of Education on how they could better improve wellbeing outcomes for school kids, but also for the general populace, as well as get greater buy-in to the climate action that the government was hoping to achieve by getting people out in nature and engaging hands-on in these activities. And I guess that is kind of the purpose behind initiatives like the Green Infrastructure Fund as well.
Thank you, Chloe. Natalie.
Yeah, great. I just wanted to add that I think the real opportunity here, and Chloe already gave a shout out to the fantastic group for the love of bees. You know, there's a real opportunity to support these grassroots organisations more, and they can be best supported by also partnering them with a lot of these businesses who oftentimes are actually trying to seek out opportunities, and it's really a case of council being the connector between, you know, these different groups to be the catalysts for opportunities, because I think in that sense, and by supporting those grassroots groups, you're sort of on funding businesses in that way, and I think that's an opportunity that we can, you know, push a lot more as we see more development happening in the city. And just in case I don't get the chance to mention it later, we have huge opportunities at the moment, you know, the land around the CRL stations, dare I mention whatever may happen with our port, to see these kinds of grassroots organisations becoming our brilliant engagement placemaking tools, so that we can actually decide together what we want those spaces to look like, and engaging businesses in that process will be critical to the success as well.
Amazing, Natalie. Thank you. Ian, did you want to add in there?
Yeah, I just wanted to link in just quite quickly with the grassroots organisations with another question that's come through around leftover spaces. So we have a term for this in planning: slope. Spaces left over after planning, which are just little bits on the corner that you can't get a dwelling on. You landscape a bit, but there's movements, particularly in the UK, called guerrilla gardening. I mean, so this doesn't have to be a formal thing by policy on the state. Is that they just planted veggies down a strip under cover of darkness, maybe, I don't know, and it started a movement of these spaces are green, but they're just monocultural deserts. There's just a little bit of grass. We don't necessarily want them to be, you know, to perform this function anymore. The community wants something different, and they just planted veggies all down there. If you Google guerrilla gardening, it's just a really cool set of grassroots people doing what they want in spaces which are left over after planning.
Yeah, amazing. Natalie, I'm just checking, is that a new hand up or an old hand?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add to that. In Auckland City, we have a whole lot of bonus floor areas, they're called. And Professor Dory Reeves has actually done a lot of work in this space. In terms of identifying them, they're places that are meant to be public, even though they're part of kind of commercial premises. And so raising the profile of those spaces as part of that whole, you know, joining the dots between business and grassroots groups, I think is part of that whole opportunity that I was speaking to. So thanks for triggering that thought, Anne.
What I'll do is follow on from a question. I'm following the rules now and actually using the chat as I was supposed to, but going to a question from the audience and opening it up to the rest of the panel as well. We're in a biodiversity crisis and climate emergency. How will central and local government ensure that people living in more dense housing have access to space to grow their own food, contribute to soil health, feeding the greater ecosystem? And welcome back, Councillor Richard Hills. It's good to have you back with us. We're already sort of in this topic, but who else would like to pick that up? Richard.
Yeah, kia ora. Sorry, I got cut off there. I mean, we are purchasing about $50 million worth of parks and reserves each year, so that that helps a bit. The other thing on berms, Councillor Pippa Coombe has been fighting this fight for 10 to 11 years or longer, that the use of berms should be an obvious thing, apart from maybe 2 or 3 rules like blocking sight lines and damaging infrastructure and being okay about it if it has to be dug up. The rest I feel like should be pretty much up to the people near those berms, or that tend to those berms, or have to mow those berms anyway. So Pippa and I are going to try again to try and loosen up that, so that people would have the opportunity to plant on those pieces of land. There are community groups already doing great, urban farming and things within the city centre and surrounds. I mean, I personally don't know if there is something standing in the way of people doing that. But myself and Pippa would follow up in a heartbeat of how we can help people have access to berms or gardens, or there's plenty of green spaces around the city that could be better utilized. And if people are having issues with that, we'll follow it up. But I mean, there's nothing that right now that I think would preclude us doing that. From a building or resource consent, I'm not sure that we could require apartments to be built with gardens or veggie gardens, or be that prescriptive. But I think a lot of people are moving that way as well, because it's actually becoming a marketable thing for whānau and for people to go to those or purchase those apartments or rent those apartments with access to soil and being able to not only be around natives but also be able to grow your own food. So yeah, any ideas are welcome, and Pippa and I would gladly follow those up.
And thinking about those sort of innovative other solutions out there, Natalie, back to you, lady, and then over to Chloe. But as you were saying before, and also, do you want to follow on from that?
Sure. I mean, I feel like I've already said enough, but I guess I think what's really interesting is that we've just seen this, huge trend over time of different community groups mobilizing. Everything from kind of your sort of has been around for a long time, like Oakley Creek, to the Sunnynook community group, with Lyford Reserve is just one example, and there's the Papakura stream restoration. And I think what would be really fantastic from an innovation point of view is to actually network those groups together as part of this whole process, because while I totally understand that tonight is about the inner city and that's critical, our whole city is a system, and so actually understanding sort of the potential impact of all these groups when we think of it in that way is where I think we'll get a real shift. And because obviously council has a really significant role, but it's about the whole team of Aucklanders is going to be required to actually, get this to work and to, turn things around for the city.
Yeah, absolutely, Natalie. Chloe.
I was just my 2 cents on this is, as far as kind of emergencies go, and I say this as the person who fought for 2 years in Parliament for the declaration of a climate emergency, don't leave the politics to the politicians. It's real easy to come through with the rhetoric, but it is, as we've all seen, politically, so-called economically difficult to do the follow-through. But we've also seen in the context of COVID-19 that all of the things that we were told for so long were politically or economically or whatever else impossible were always a matter of political willpower. So I'd say, I've got in the background here, I'm going up Queen Street, the school strike from a year or 2 ago now, and that was mass mobilisation of a bunch of rangatahi, but nonetheless, that one-off action is unfortunately, while a huge, amazing effort, not going to be the thing that is going to require that sustained effort through the 9 to 12 months that it takes for policy to pass through Parliament into legislation, let alone for a budget. So I think all eyes actually need to be on the budget in May next year in Parliament to see if it lives up to the challenge of what is particularly going to be something informed by the emissions reductions plans and the nationally determined contribution to be announced in the not too distant future. But I also just wanted to ask this question actually to Narimu, because I understand that there's been some mahi on Marakai out at the marae. So I think that there's some amazing lessons that we can learn about that kaupapa and about that mahi, and how we can get more of that happening across Tamaki Makaurau.
Yeah, just thinking historically, we had some epic gardens in Tamaki. I'm just thinking of Ngamara a Tahuri. Another name is Kuhiawheto Ngamara a Tahuri. Our great ancestress, who was like, she had market gardens that went from Maunga Kia north side all the way to Ellerslie, which is 2 kilometres. Huge gardens. So once we're gardeners, we were. Our generation has very much lost those skills that our great grandparents had. They were living by the maramataka. My great grandparents' generation, less so the grandparents, and definitely not my parents or my generation. So it's a lost skill and art that we have been trying to bring back. I've had a couple of goes at community gardens, marakai, with spectacular failures. 100 people turn up on day one. Month later, there's 5 people, and 3 months later, it's weeds. So I've had a few goes, but we have learned a lot, and we do now have a pretty epic garden up at Pourewa, which is up Kepa Road in Orake. And that was developed by Rob Small, who came into our iwi from a parks background, actually, and did his thesis on maramataka and marakai. And so that one's really pumping at the moment. It's probably only operating, it looks like, at about 33%, but a heap of kaya is coming out of there. We've had kumara, plenty of kumara come out of there. And it's just beginning to really engage whānau in the village. We have Tuesdays you can go and pick up free veggies. I guess the next part is then to teach everyone how to make kale taste nice. So we'll need to add those sorts of lessons. But yeah, that is definitely something to come and visit and look at and learn from, and advise us on as well, because we're still learning. And yeah, I guess it's more places like that we need right across our city, so that people can connect with. And we have a lot of Housing New Zealand Kāinga Ora homes very near to that garden as well. So that's one of the aims, is to bring people in, attract them in, and they can lighten the load on their household bills by grabbing some kai and helping out in the garden.
Awesome. Kia ora, Ngāti Mu. Ian, we might come to you next with that Greenwall question, but is it all right to just go to Hal, who's had his hand up very politely for a long time now?
Thanks, Frith. I was just really on the back of what Natalie was saying around, us as Auckland Council working with local community groups. I think we've learned a lot over the last decade around, how do we engage with our communities, especially in the Parks Department. We certainly, I guess our main goal is to try and connect with the people that want to volunteer and provide, I guess, love and care to our parks, and we're just a facilitator and an enabler. And a big shout out to our, regional park staff and our volunteer coordinators in the local parks that, work with communities. We deliver hundreds of thousands of hours of work across the region and the network of, 4,000 odd parks. In terms of that sort of growing locally, like Ngārimu, I've, in my time at council, seen community gardens, come and go. It needs, I guess, a little bit of that sort of structure put around it. And I'm all for guerrilla gardening, Ian. It's a challenging space to get into. But, from a council perspective, with the landowner, we're more than happy to work with communities to see what we can do to grow food within parks. But we also need the communities to work with us to help us support, what we're trying to do in terms of planting, looking after, etc. So I guess it's a two-way agreement in some ways. We are certainly there to try and facilitate the public and their accessibility to parks and work with the various spaces that we have. Unfortunately, sometimes we're constrained, as you know, like some of our parks, unfortunately, have been, previously landfills. So growing food on them is not particularly appropriate in some cases. The same with planting, veggie gardens next to the road corridor. We still have diesel buses that put out a lot of particulates. So there are things to think about in terms of, growing in your local, road corridor, street environments. But I guess for us as a Parks Department, we want to work with the public to help. Narimu's example around what they're doing at Porirua is, I'd encourage everybody to go and have a look. It's a fantastic operation. It really does. It brings a life and spirit to the place. You can see the people that working there are really getting something out of it.
Amazing. There's a lovely question in the chat, which I might come back to you, around how people can get involved. But Ian, can we address the green wall question, please? Are green walls starting to join green roofs is something that developers are doing and councils are allowing?
Yeah, green walls are really cool, actually. I mean, literally, they are cooling. That's my one joke.
Hey.
So enjoy it. If you've ever been near one, they are really, they're nice things to look at, and they do change the atmosphere, and they do cool it. It's difficult because the problem we have is that the research suggests that it's not a policy problem as such, because it's a developer architecture desire, really. They're worried about ongoing maintenance, if it looks a bit crap, if things die, and they're worried whether they know how to do it. And we did some research in the UK on where were the green roofs, and to cross-reference the green roofs with the policy framework. So you'd imagine places with better, stronger policy would have more green roofs, but there wasn't any correlation at all. One of the places that had it was it turned out it was just a guy like Howell, who worked at the council, who was just, and it'd get wind of developers doing something, and you'd chat to them and they'd put it in, and you'd sort of de-risk it a little bit by showing them how to do it. So it was around champions within the council that really pushed it, and within the architecture sector as well as the development sector. So it's limited to mandate this. I mean, Germany did it with some of their sort of green roofs coverage, but the green roofs are just not as effective because they're so high up. Their cooling effect is so far removed from where you are, is that it doesn't translate as well as green walls.
Thank you. It's one of those things that's moved a conversation on, but maybe there's more conversations to go on from there. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really conscious of sending you all home on time. So what we're going to start doing now is getting into our final few questions. So please, panelists, if something that you haven't been able to say that you want to say, jump in there and raise your hand. I'm going to go for this question that's just come through. How can we better enable leftover spaces? What did you say, Ian? Slopes, i.e. public open space that is not used for sports, that is just planted with grass in our city, not just the city centre, to be planted with native trees more urgently, noting that council has limited resources to do this themselves. I think it probably also relates to the micro question. How can we make, I think you said this, Ian, the small gestures that actually carry a lot in this conversation. Feelings from the panel, how can we do this?
I think once again, it's about that ground up. What Ian was saying and what Nadima was saying as well around, you need community around something. Council can't just enable something and hope it works. So I think we've got funds that we passed this year, for that people can apply for, community groups and to partner with us. Our urban Ngāhere strategy, now almost every local board is rolling out their own urban Ngāhere strategy, and it is about those little bits and those little areas and places you can have mini biodiversity, mini forests, basically. There's so many good ideas in Northcote. It feels like it's been forever, over a decade, right? Frith, Te Ara Awataha, the Northcote Greenway, just years of what we thought, and it was largely ideas from kids, from school students, and it felt like an impossible idea. Now we're redeveloping that space with Panuku and Kāinga Ora, and the Greenway is going to be backed onto all the schools. So the ownership there, the kaitiaki is the schools. Mana Whenua have been working with the Kaipatiki project, kind of everyone getting around together. So you have the ownership. So there will be food forests and gardens, but there will be a whole lot of native greenery there, but that it's also an infrastructure project to prevent flooding and to improve water quality. But those ideas can only come from community, and they can only come if everyone works together. Council is not great at just pointing things out and hoping that they work. They really need the ground up work. And I've seen when I was on the local board, a small group of people, volunteers, like begging us to do stuff in our parks and reserves. now with a little bit of support from council over time, it's grown. Pest-free Kaipātiki's there now. I think there's something like 87 halos across Kaipātiki with hundreds of volunteers, and that's just neighbours doing, there might be one thing a year, one plant or one rat trap or one whatever it is, and people work on their strengths. And I think if you have ideas, take them to your local board, take them to there's community groups all over the city, talk to your local iwi, and there's something for everyone, or create an idea yourself. But I guess if you're waiting for council to figure out what to do with all those little bits, it probably will take a while and it'll be bureaucratic. So we really need like people to step up and ask us for help, or just ask for don't ask for help and just do it and then apologize later. But I didn't say that.
Didn't hear you, didn't record you saying that. Just as a shout out, if anybody who was in the Untouched World Awataha Stream project, it was over a decade ago, is listening to this call, your work counted. I know you're all grown-ups now, but your work counted, just to pass that on. Hal, my friend, you have your hand up.
Yes, thanks, Ruth. Really just following on from what Richard said in terms of, how do people make use of these spaces within our parks network, is go and talk to your local board, and talk to our local volunteer coordinators. You'll find a lot of information through Auckland Council's website. If you go to our parks Facebook page, you'll find we're able to connect. We will be able to connect you to a local volunteer group that can help with, as Richard said, trapping or tree planting or weed control. So really, it's about, we can help enable, but the communities also need to reach out to us, and then we can work with them and help provide them with the tools, because I think that's where our best successes are going to be going forward with, is to actually provide the tools to the local communities to help them look after the parks in the way that they would like to see our parks looked after. We can provide those base services, but yeah, the extra little bit, that's where we look on our communities to try and help us. And yeah, the local boards are definitely a place to start. As Richard said, they've 16 of the local boards now are involved in the local board Ngāhere program, and they provided funding, and we've helped them develop, specialized individual planting plans or planting opportunities for each of their local board areas. And in those documents, there's opportunities for the public to have feedback, call our call center, and they can put people in touch with how to best get connected with our volunteer groups, etc., that we have out there. So yeah, there's certainly, we want to help. We just need people to put their hand up.
Amazing. Can I just acknowledge the person who's identified themselves as a young student? Good on you for being here, and good on you for your passion and what he just said. Get in there.
And just on that, Frith, a lot of just on the council resource and the promise around the urban aheri, I saw a question earlier, a lot of that will go to the areas of need. Everyone will get a little bit with the 10-year budgets that we put forward, but it will be going to those local boards who have 6 and 9% urban street canopy, and those are where those big trees are going to go, and those are where the focus has to go. Because I have 35% urban tree cover in my local board area, I am going to get a little bit more, but we need to focus on those areas which are so poorly served, and it's unfair that kids are still growing up with no trees.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Hills. I'm going to squeeze 2 more questions in. To the whole panel, agree that green spaces create places for all well-beings to come together. What we're missing with this discussion is the connectivity between these spaces. We can't design spaces that are inaccessible, e.g. places that are not wheelchair or pushchair friendly, and probably, yeah. Does anyone want to take a go at answering that one for me? Natalie.
Yeah, this is a fantastic point. And just to kind of give an overseas example, I'm sometimes reluctant to do that because I think we can actually do better than overseas. We have Te Ao Māori, so we definitely should be doing better in terms of green spaces and that connection to our environment. But one amazing place where I've had the pleasure of going is Freiburg in Germany, where there's a neighborhood called Vauban. And what's so fantastic about that area is that accessibility is actually baked into the design of that place. And here I often kind of feel like grey guides you, whereas there you genuinely feel that green guides you. So all the kind of access to mobility is really framed around this network of green spaces, and it's visual. They have light rail corridors that are planted in grass. When you sort of, cross the road, you're actually crossing that what feels like a green space, and from a distance especially visually looks like one. But they also have all the kind of significant wraparound social service. So it's not just about planting trees, it's about all the programs, and there's a whole kind of economic development component to this around how they set up their businesses to make them accessible. And again, I just think that that's a really great example, without going into too much more detail, that we can learn from. And again, it's that whole systems approach to solving the problem.
Beautiful, Natalie. Thank you. Chloe.
Yeah, I mean, one of the core tenets, again, to refer back to the City Centre Master Plan, which is a beautiful, wonderful document, first released in 2012 and refreshed in 2020 with its own website, is access for everyone. And while that totally is talking about the design of Auckland City Centre, it also very much has at its core accessibility and streets for people. To give you an example of something that has been a really interesting space to kind of have this fight, it's actually been the playground on Parliament's lawn. So when I was first elected at the end of 2017, there was a lot of moves to make Parliament more family friendly, and the Speaker announced that we would be having a playground on Parliament's lawn. I wrote to him at that point in time, pointing out that unless it was a playground available for and accessible for all children, then it probably didn't fit particularly well with the kaupapa that he was trying to promote, and put forward a number of design and accessibility principles, which should be, I think, core tenet to everything that at the very least the public sector is funding. And at that point in time, I didn't hear anything back, and a few months later, plans were solidified, and I was later told that the heritage standards around Parliament's building and the character protections or whatever else was being extrapolated ultimately meant that the playground had to be designed at 150k odd, that it ended up being developed to look the way that it did, being a slide and some steps that kids could play on, which again is not something accessible to kids in wheelchairs or with other disabilities. So I think so often we end up prioritizing something like aesthetics when it should be the case that form follows function, and it should be the case that we should be putting people at the center of everything that we're designing, and people of all walks of life, including those that are so frequently excluded from being at the decision-making table. And there's some really great universal accessibility standards that we can impose on the way that we do things here. I guess, just finally, talking about how we can make that more accessible to everybody, particularly to apartment dwellers and to the new homes that we're hoping will come on stream as a result of things like the NPSUD changes, that all comes down to creating some universal standards, because the products will then fit that mold. So there's some great opportunities with potentially building and construction requirements.
Amazing. Thank you, Chloe. Narimu, if I can go to you for the last question. If we were to adopt more of this approach, is there a particular area in the city centre that you feel we should be turning our collective focus to, physical or otherwise?
Yeah, we need to take back our port and replant that. That would help. It's about 80 hectares. That's a good start. Unfortunately, there's little political appetite for that right now or anytime soon. But yeah, I think there's been a few questions tonight around. I think it's around connectivity. That is probably something. I know there's corridors talked about. And how are we working on that, but it's probably how do we connect everybody up, from the apartment dweller, from the developer, from the young student who wants to find out where they can help out somewhere, and then how do we connect up the street trees with the patches of little bits of recovering bush connected to then the bigger patch that might be in the domain that then connects with Whenua Rangatira Bastion Point, then to Kepa Bush, and so on, and tell that story, tell that narrative, so it kind of makes sense to someone who might be a first homeowner who's just bought an apartment or a terrace house on the edge of the city, and they can I don't know, figure out how they might be able to do their little bit. That they might plant a kowhai if they've got a bit of space, that might do just a little bit for them. So yeah, probably not one thing other than getting our port back is yeah, how might we tell that narrative and connect all of that up a bit better, so everyone can know their role and what little thing or big thing that they could do to contribute.
Thank you so much, Narimu. It has been a very great privilege to be with you all in this conversation. So thank you so much, panelists, for bringing what you've brought. A really important conversation for our city. And sorry, what just sprang to the top of my head is we need to think like the trees. We need to remember we're all connected and be together in this journey. So thank you for your wise words and for your help in steering this fine city that we live in.